Welcome to the Alcohol Minimalist Podcast. I'm your host, Molly Watts. If you want to change your drinking habits and create a peaceful relationship with alcohol, you're in the right place. This podcast explores the strategies I use to overcome a lifetime of family alcohol abuse, more than 30 years of anxiety and worry about my own drinking, and what felt like an unbreakable daily drinking habit. Becoming an alcohol minimalist means removing excess alcohol from your life so it doesn't remove you from life. It means being able to take alcohol or leave it without feeling deprived. It means to live peacefully, being able to enjoy a glass of wine without feeling guilty and without needing to finish the bottle. With science on our side, we'll shatter your past patterns and eliminate your excuses. Changing your relationship with alcohol is possible. I'm here to help you do it. Let's start now. Well, hello and welcome back to the Alcohol Minimalist Podcast. With me, your host, Molly Watts, coming to you from, it is a resplendent Oregon. Absolute fact, I went in and actually tried to look up some new words, some new adjectives to describe what has been a pattern of these just magnificent days here in Oregon. I know I have talked about it a lot over the last few weeks, but resplendent actually means, and I quote, attractive and impressive through being richly colorful or sumptuous. Oh, that describes Oregon very well right now. The colors, the leaves, the beautiful blue skies, and this crisp golden glow of sunshine, because we just have not had, we did have one day of rain, one really rainy day this last week, which was kind of actually nice, which you kind of, you're in trouble when you're starting to think it's nice when it rains here in Oregon, because trust me, there will come a time, you'll hear it soon, when I am not thinking that the rain is so nice. Anyway, how's it going? Welcome back. You're now into our second full week of More Sober October. I hope it's going really well for you. If it's feeling like it's difficult already, that's not unusual. And when you're trying to make habit change stick, that can be one of those things that derails us, and I don't want it to. So I hope that you are using it as an opportunity to get compassionate and curious with yourself. If you hadn't checked it out last week and you want to, this is a really good opportunity to utilize this month as a way of transitioning into long-term behavior change. And I have a 30-day email mini program, which includes the audio version of my book. It includes 30 days of continuous emails, and they are neuroscience focused. So they're not just about alcohol. I talk about it all the time. What I teach is really a meta skill for life in general, but certainly then there's also tactics and tools for using to change your drinking habits within that program too. It's called Drink Less Success. You can check it out on my website, www.mollywatts.com/drinkless. And I think it's actually drink-less. mollywatts.com, drink-less. Check it out. This week on the podcast, so thrilled to be able to share this conversation with you with Dr. Danielle Dick. Dr. Danielle Dick is a professor of psychology and genetics, and she's also the author of a book called The Child Code. She's also internationally recognized and an award-winning expert on genetic and environmental influences on human behavior. She has led and contributed to more than 25 grants from the National Institutes of Health, with grant funding totaling more than $55 million. She has more than 425 peer-reviewed publications in the areas of child development, addiction, mental health, genetics, and human behavior. She is named one of the most highly cited researchers in the entire world. And a lot of her work has focused on how genes and working with our genes makes everything else work better. So this conversation, for many of you that have been around for a long time, you know that one of the things that kept me stuck in my drinking habits for a really long time was my belief that I was just genetically predisposed to desire alcohol more because of my
my mother, who was physically dependent upon alcohol and who had severe alcohol use disorder. So I really believed that part of the reason that I struggled to control my drinking was because of my genetics. And so this has been a long-standing thing that I did a lot of research for my own book on this, and I was really glad to hear that the things that I've said all along the line are validated by what Danielle said as well. And I think you're going to love this conversation. It's an important one. So here is my conversation with Dr. Danielle Dick. Have a great week, everybody. I will see you on Thursday for Think Thursday. Good morning, Danielle. Thank you so much for being here on the Alcohol Minimalist podcast. As you've already noted, and we've talked about before we even hop on here, I am suffering from a bit of a cold. So hopefully we're going to get through this without me coughing your ear off. I really appreciate you being here. Welcome to the show. And thank you again for taking the time to talk with me about alcohol and the genetic factors that play a part in developing alcohol use disorder. You've got a lot of research that you've focused your attention on over the tenure of your career. But we first got connected from your involvement with Seek, the health test that I shared here on the show. And so tell me how that connection first started. And again, thanks for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me, Molly. And really, the way that I got involved with Seek, and which also contributes to, being on your podcast, is that I have been a researcher for 25 plus years now. And my work involves studying, that big question of why some people are more likely to develop problems with alcohol and other drugs, and how that risk is a product of our genes and our environments and how they come together across development. And one of my big passions as a researcher is not just publishing in scientific journals and talking at scientific meetings, which is what us researchers spend a lot of our time doing, but also getting that research out to the people who can use it. And so to that end, I wrote a book, and I also have become involved with a number of different startups to help ensure that the research is really being integrated into products and other kinds of resources that are getting out to people who can benefit from them.
I love that because understanding science for me really helped me turn around my decades long daily drinking habit. And so using science and making it understandable for people is something that I am absolutely passionate about as well. So let's talk about how did you decide, like, I'm going to study genetics and their implications into addiction? How does that become something that you're interested in?
So for me, it dates back to when I was an undergraduate at the University of Virginia, and I was actually pre-med. I was studying to become a medical doctor, and I took a psychology class, and I became fascinated by the brain as really the last frontier of medicine, and how we know so much less when it comes to substance use and mental health disorders as compared to so many other medical conditions. And I happened to be taking a class on genetics at that same time. And I went into my advisor and I said, wow, I'm really enjoying this psychology class and I'm really enjoying this genetics class. And like so many things in life, it's kind of the slings and arrows of how it all comes together. And she essentially said to me, well, you can put those things together. And we actually have a professor here who is one of, the world's leading experts on how genetic and environmental influences come together to impact behavior. And so I ended up doing research with him. And that's when I really got bit by the research bug, because I was also working on a psychiatric unit. And one of the challenging things that, all of us who have been affected by these disorders, who have loved ones who are affected, one of the really challenging things that we all deal with is the recurring nature, how challenging it is to move into recovery, stay in recovery, or if you have depression or more severe mental illness. We saw a lot of kind of that, what we called the revolving door of people who would come into psychiatric treatment, leave, and then be back. And it occurred to me, even as my 18, 19-year-old self gosh, if we just better understood what was causing these disorders, perhaps we could do a better job of preventing and treating them. And that's what led to, this path that I have been on for the last 20 some years. And one of the really exciting things is that there really have been such radical advances in genetics over that time period. And we have learned so much about how genetic influences contribute to alcohol and other drug problems. And so we're really at the cusp now of being able to have that research make a meaningful difference in prevention and treatment. And so hopefully we can get into some of those
Yeah.
details today.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about that a little bit more in depth. So, one of the things that I hear or I know that I saw that I've researched is that if you have a parent who has alcohol use disorder, you are 4 times more likely to develop alcohol use disorder yourself. And so I used to read that and extrapolate from that that there was a genetic predisposition to become someone who developed alcohol use disorder. I used to look at it and think that that meant because I did have a parent who was physically dependent on alcohol, that I was therefore more genetically likely to desire alcohol more. That's the way that I read it. That's the way that I interpreted it. That there was a physiological connection to my use of alcohol. And I think that that's not uncommon. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely. And so I find that there is a growing understanding that there is a genetic contribution to alcohol use problems and other substance use problems. But most people, when they hear that, they think of exactly what you're saying, Molly. They think, ooh, if I try a particular drug and I'm genetically at risk, it means I am more likely to become physiologically dependent on that drug, whether that's alcohol or opiates or cannabis. And there is some truth to that. So there are genes that influence the way our bodies metabolize drugs, which are specific to different classes of drugs. And if you carry particular genetic risk factors, it can influence, how quickly that gets broken down, how sick or not it makes you, which can influence how much you like it. And so that is a component of genetic risk, but it's actually just a tiny component of genetic risk. And so the much bigger way that our genes influence risk for substance use problems isn't related to the way bodies respond to drugs. It's actually related to the ways that our brains are wired. And so we talk about two big genetically influenced risk pathways that are not physiological, that are related to the way brains are wired. And the biggest one is what we call externalizing, right? This is the way we relate to the external world. And it's the way that our brains process risk and reward and consequences. And so it's related to things like risk taking and impulsivity, things that we all vary on. And we know that some people, some brains are wired to be much more excited by things that are new, by things that are right in front of them. And there's a good reason that our brains evolved to be reward seeking, right? Things that are rewarding, food, sex, etc., like they help keep the human species alive and going. But we also know that, if you are focused too much on what's right in front of you, how exciting it is, that some brains essentially are focused a lot on that and they discount the consequences, right? So they're less likely to think through long-term effects. And so, the classic example, I do a lot of work with teenagers and young adults. We know that's a big risk period for early onset of problems. Is when the friend shows up at the dorm room and says, hey, do you want to go to this party? And you're studying for an exam, that friend is a highly salient reward. And you're thinking, I can walk out that door right now and it'll be tons of fun. Maybe there's, others that you have romantic interests that are going to be there, etc. Now, it's a long-term process to stop and think through, ooh, but if I go with this friend right now, then I might not get as much studying done. I might not do as well on that test later this week. If my GPA is lower, I might not get into medical school. I really want to be a doctor one day. Like, that's a whole lot of long-term, future, complicated planning. And so some folks have brains that are just much more focused on the rewarding principles and properties of what's right in front of them. And that's actually one of the biggest ways that our genes influence risk for substance use problems.
Yes, the externalizing. And those people are, I will link in the show notes some of your videos. What I took away is that externalizing is actually the people that are at the highest risk for developing substance problems. Is that accurate?
Yes, so that is the biggest component of genetic risk is this, way brains are processed to focus on rewards and novel kind of things. And by the way, that shows up because we're all born with our genes. One of the interesting things about substance use problems is that most people don't wake up one morning and say, "Oh, I've had an onset of alcohol use disorder or
Right?
opioid use disorder." So if we think about, okay, what are ways that we can recognize genetic risk early and intervene? So that sort of predisposition toward more impulsivity, more risk taking, it shows up in the little kids who are the ones who are dangling out of trees and giving parents a heart attack and ending up in ERs a lot. And then it's those kids as adolescents and young people, they're more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD. They're more likely to have conduct problems and maybe to act out and kind of be pushing the edge of the envelope in adolescence. They're then more likely to experiment with alcohol or other drugs once those start to come online. And a key piece that I want to emphasize here is that when we think about and understand how genetic risk works, you can also see how these are not genes for alcohol use disorder.
Mhm.
These are genes that influence the way brains are wired, and risk taking is not a bad thing in and of itself. CEOs, entrepreneurs, fighter pilots, they're all higher on risk taking, but it can lead one to potentially develop problems. And so that's why I talk a lot about it's so important to understand genetic risk, because when we see it early and when we understand what it means, we can both for ourselves and for our kids think about, okay, how do you channel that disposition toward things that are going to be healthy and productive and still fulfilling and exciting, and not end up going down pathways that might potentially lead to problems like heavy substance use.
Got it. Okay. And so we talked about physiological, we've talked about externalizing. Another place where risk tends to be is internalizing. So talk to me about those people.
Yes. So the third of those three genetically influenced risk pathways that I mentioned is internalizing. This is related to our own internal worlds. And so this is how our brains are wired to relate to anxiety sensitivity or depression proneness. And so we know that some of us are born with brains that are just wired toward more fearfulness, toward more anxiety. And again, there's upsides of those traits as well, too. A little bit of anxiety, a little bit of fear might cause you to be more conscientious, prepare for your exam the next day, etc. Be a good listener, a good friend. But we also know that if one is really kind of higher on anxiety or depression proneness and doesn't learn skills and strategies to manage that, that substance use can be one of the ways that is an unhealthy way that individuals learn to cope, or essentially start to use substances to cope with depression and anxiety. That tends to be a genetically influenced pathway that shows up a little bit later. So it's the more externalizing, risk-taking adolescents who are more likely to start experimenting earlier and using in riskier ways. For individuals who are higher on that internalizing risk pathway. We know that because so much of adolescent substance use tends to be social, and sometimes people who are more prone toward anxiety or fearfulness tend to be less engaged in some of those settings, that actually it's usually a little bit later. So it's more in the kind of mid to later 20s or later in life that those dispositions can then show up as essentially heavier use of substances to address that kind of anxiety or depression.
It's all so great and so fascinating to me. And I think it really says or states to me that, which I think is the thing that people are always wanting to, the reason that people want to figure out, like, is there a gene for alcohol use disorders? Like, if we could isolate something, then we could like treat that one thing and everybody could never have a problem with alcohol. And that's just not the case. It's just not that simple. I always call it our beautiful, brilliant human brains. They're so complex, and there isn't one gene that is going to be able to be isolated, and there isn't one set of uh, external circumstances or the nature versus nurture. Like, there is so much that goes into developing a substance use disorder, whether it's genetic or environment. We have to look at it all together. And I that's one of the things that I really appreciated about your work, and that I gained from everything that I looked at. You don't look at it as one versus the other. You look at it all
Absolutely.
together.
Yes. And so we've talked a lot about these genetically influenced risk pathways. And of course, it's important to point out too that, they're not mutually exclusive. We can carry risk across, one or more of these pathways. And all of us carry some level of genetic risk, right? We're all at risk for something. For some of us, it's cardiovascular diseases or cancers. And for some of us, it's substance use disorders or other psychiatric outcomes. When it comes to complex outcomes like alcohol use disorder or other mental health disorders, one of the ways that we conceptualize it, with full credit to my friend Janine Austin, who is the world's leading psychiatric geneticist, genetic counselor. And so she gives the analogy of, imagine that we all have a mental health jar. So you've got a picture of kind of one of those clear, glass mason jars. And when our jar is full, that's when you're actively experiencing problems. So that's when you're actively, for example, having alcohol problems. Now, when we think about what are the things that can make that jar full, well, there's genetic risk. So imagine, we're putting some marbles in that jar. That's, the first thing. And we all start life with some marbles in that jar. Some of us are just going to have a few. So maybe it's only, the bottom inch of that jar. That's low genetic risk. Some people are going to have a little more. That's kind of moderate genetic risk. And some people, their jar might be 3/4 of the way full just by, the unfortunate luck of the draw when it came to their genetic risk. So what are the other things? But nobody's jar starts out full, right? Nobody's born with an alcohol use problem. But then what are the other things that happen that go in that jar that can lead to it getting full? Well, that's where our environmental factors come in. And so now you can imagine, okay, now we're adding in, let's say, some rocks. Those are the environmental risk factors that we encounter. So you could start life with low genetic risk, but have a lot of environmental risk factors. And that could lead to your jar being full and having problems. On the other hand, if you start life, if your jar's 3/4 of the way full with genetic risk, it's not going to take as many rocks, as many environmental risk factors to experience problems. So we're all a product of our genes and our environments. And hopefully this analogy can also help you think about how recovery and you might have had problems but no longer have to experience problems, how that's possible, because we can either remove some of the environmental risk factors, because genes alone are never going to determine risk. They're never going to make that jar full on their own. And you could also think about, we can layer in environmental protective factors. So now imagine we're putting rims on the top of that mason jar so it's taller, and then we can take more stuff in that jar before it gets full. And those protective factors are things like having, supportive families and friends and activities that don't involve unhealthy alcohol or other drug use, having stable housing and good job opportunities. And some of the things that we know when individuals don't have that, it can lead to using substances to cope and to manage some of those hardships. And so that's the way that we kind of think about every individual is a product of both their genes and their environments, and you have to take both into account.
Hey there, it's Molly taking a quick break to talk with you about Sunnyside. You all know that Sunnyside is my app of choice and my recommendation for a tool to help you create sustainable change around your drinking. One of the things that I love about Sunnyside is their commitment to improving the user experience, and that has been a constant since I started working with them nearly 3 years ago now. Since June this year, they have added the Android version of their iOS app, so now it's available for Apple users and all Android users. It's the same Sunnyside experience across all of those devices, and it's just another example of their commitment to improving the user experience. Another example would be the fact that now you can set it up for push notifications. So you can take all of the daily texts, the reminders, and put them into a push preference so that you determine how you want to receive the support from Sunnyside. I would love for you to check it out. Go to www.sunnyside.co/Molly to get started with a 15-day free trial today.
One of the things that I think is important that, or I would love to hear your thoughts on, is we have all this genes environment, which our environments are continually changing over the course of our lives, right? So we can look backwards at our upbringing and in the past. Our genetic pool is kind of there from the time we're young, and it's not evolving in the same way as our environment's evolving, but our ability to change the outcome of our whether that's a mental health outcome or a behavioral outcome, how much agency do we have in overriding either the genetics or improving our I guess it would be improving our environment, right? Whether it's taking care of our health and our brains in a different way, or learning how to cope in different ways with some of that internalizing or externalizing maybe behavior that we've had over the course of our lives. Do people have the agency, the capacity to learn about themselves and actually impact the outcomes in their lives as they become adults, or as an adult, when I'm looking at this like, okay, well, this is who I was, this is who I am, this is how I got here, but that's not where I want to go. I want to go that direction. So how does that work?
I'm so glad you asked that. That's such a key piece because this gets back to DNA is not destiny. And yes, we all have genetically influenced dispositions, which are going to impact our risk. But especially when it comes to substance use problems, this is one of the areas where, we can pretty easily wrap our head around how the environment can play a big role in either exacerbating genetic risk or, on the other hand, trumping genetic risk. So you can imagine, if we lived in a world where there was no alcohol, then, or even, some countries or cultures or religious groups have less or reduced alcohol that are part of that culture, then essentially, if you never take a drink, you are never going to develop alcohol use problems, right? The environment has just trumped genetic effects. Doesn't matter what your genetic predisposition is. On the other hand, we can think about like all the sort of, in between ways that less extreme environments can exacerbate or reduce risk. And so, for example, you can imagine one of the things I study adolescents a lot. What we have found is that adolescents who carry genetic risk, we know that parental monitoring, so parent relationships, can have a big effect on how much kids are using alcohol. We actually, as parents, do, I have a teenager, despite what they tell us all the time about, you're not the boss of me. we actually, we can play a big role in, are we asking them where they're going, what they're doing, who they're with, et cetera, and which we refer to as parental monitoring. So we know that with more engaged monitoring parents, i.e., adolescents have less access and ability to kind of use alcohol or put themselves in risky circumstances, that everybody, all kids who have higher levels of parental monitoring, levels of kind of substance use go down. But for kids who are carrying elevated genetic risk, the drop off is much more pronounced, such that at high levels of parental monitoring, we see no evidence of genetic effects on how much kids are using alcohol and other drugs in adolescence. So parents are able to really change the likelihood that their adolescents, regardless of their genetic disposition, are going to be engaging in this more high risk behavior. So that's kind of one example. You could also think about, we talk a lot about trauma or social determinants of health. If you are carrying a riskier genetic disposition and you are in environmental circumstances that are very challenging, then it makes it more likely that one is going to develop problems related to alcohol or other drugs. And so we can think of kind of risk environments can exacerbate genetic risk. So they make it even more likely that if you're carrying some of those genetic risk factors, you'll develop problems. But protective environments can actually reduce risk. And here's the other key piece. Some of our environments just happen to us, right? We've seen tragic examples of that this week with hurricanes and other kinds of things. But most environments, we actually play a role in shaping. And so here's what I mean by that. We talked about externalizing being one of the biggest genetic risk factors. Well, a predisposition toward more risk-taking, more impulsivity, those people who have that, that disposition, they are also more likely to select into peer groups as adolescents where there are other more risk-taking and impulsive adolescents. They are also then more likely to potentially provide access to alcohol, more acceptance of alcohol. Now, what you have is an environment that is conducive and essentially to exacerbating one's genetic risk. This is why I think it's so important that, as parents, by understanding what are the ways that we might see some of these risky tendencies that genetic risk might be showing up in our kids, we can be thinking about changing and shaping some of the environments to reduce their risk. And as we get older, we can also, by understanding and thinking about ourselves and by knowing a little bit about how this risk might be manifesting, we can also then think about what are the ways that we are creating circumstances, how are we maybe putting ourselves in environments with respect to the people that we're spending time with, et cetera, that might make it harder for us to make the best choices for our health. And we have the ability to think about and shape our environments in different ways. And so that's really gets at this heart of, I think by understanding one's genetic risk, you can make the best choices for promoting your health and well-being.
So let's talk about that. When we say understanding my genetic risk, how do I, just as a layperson, do I just look back at kind of my life and try to say, oh, okay, I've always been somebody who's done this or liked this? How do just average people figure out kind of their own genetic risk?
Such a great question. So I find that a lot of people, when I talk to them about these 3 genetically influenced pathways, can kind of reflect on themselves and go like, oh, let's run through each of them. Physiological. Oh, yes. The first time I ever tried alcohol, I could tell something was different, about the way I liked it or, opiates. Several people have that experience, et cetera. Externalizing. Most people get like, oh, yep, I was that impulsive, risk-taking kid. I was the one pushing the edge of the envelope. That's kind of been who I have been. Or Yep, I'm somebody who has always been a little more prone toward anxiety or depression. And the first time that I tried alcohol or other drugs was the first time I felt normal in my own skin, that those feelings sort of melted away a little bit. And that felt amazing. And so, one is, I think, when you sort of understand what that risk looks like, you can start to reflect on yourself. But we also, as researchers, have all kinds of ways to measure it. And so, actually, if you go to my website, danielledick.com, I try and make a lot of resources available. And one of the things I have on there is what's called the SERPs questionnaire, the Substance Use Risk Profiles. And it actually has a whole series of questions that you can fill out about yourself and score to give you a sense of where you fall on some of these externalizing and internalizing dimensions.
That's
And then
awesome.
the last exciting piece, if I can, is that you mentioned earlier there is no gene for alcohol problems. There's no gene for any of these complex outcomes. No gene for opioid use disorder, no gene for depression. Instead, what we know is that there are thousands of genetic variants across the genome, each of which just increase or decrease risk a little bit. But what we are able to do now that was not even possible 5 years ago is we have collected data from literally millions of individuals, and we can scan the entire genome. And we're looking for areas where people who are higher on problems or who are affected with a disorder. We do this exactly the same way if you're studying cardiovascular disease or alcohol use problems. We're saying, okay, are people who are higher on problems or who have the disorder, are they more likely to carry a particular variant at this location in the genome? And so we can identify those thousands of locations. We sum them all up and weight them by their effect size to create for any individual their genetic risk score, what we sometimes call polygenic scores. Poly meaning many, many of these locations across the genome. And in my sort of passion to get this information, get cutting edge research out to people, we actually just launched a website. It's addictionrisk.com within the last couple weeks, where individuals can get access to their personal genetic risk scores. But because genes are just part of it, we've also done studies of these tens of thousands of kids followed from childhood into adulthood to identify what are the early behaviors and the environments that are most predictive of who goes on to develop problems. So there's a short survey about kind of behaviors and environments that are most predictive of developing problems. And you can fill out a short survey. We mail you a saliva kit, you spit in a tube, it gets sent off to the lab, and we can create these genetic risk scores. And then we put them together to help individuals understand what their personal risk profile is, both genetic and behavioral and environmental factors, so that one can then think about, how do I, knowing this, make the best choices for my health and what I want out of life.
That is amazing. That is so exciting. I'm so glad that you're here and introducing that. We will link it all in the show notes, folks, so you can take advantage of that or learn more about it, both at Danielle's website and give me the URL one more time for addiction.
It's addictionrisk.com.
Okay,
And
great.
we call it the CARES platform, Comprehensive Addiction Risk Evaluation System.
Awesome. Here on the show, it's not a recovery program. We're not talking about people that have actually developed alcohol use disorder as much, but we're talking about, but understanding. And the reason that I really want to have people link this together in their own minds is that understanding our brains, understanding what drives our behavior, the internalizing, externalizing, all of these factors go into how we develop a psychological dependence on alcohol, which usually, like you said, you don't wake up and go, "Oh, I've got alcohol use disorder." You turn to it most often either because you are using it to, you're a risk taker, and you develop a use pattern, which then, as over time, can create a more severe alcohol use disorder problem and or a physical dependency. But it's understanding the psychological part, which is what I love about all of your work and all of this information, understanding that psychological part, understanding that we do have, agency even in the genetic background, the environmental background. When we really understand ourselves, understand that where all of this comes together, we can make better choices. And for some people, that may mean that they're better off never drinking alcohol in the first place, or deciding that maybe this is for me, my most peaceful relationship with alcohol is zero, right? That can very possibly be the case. But I also want people to understand that the story behind recovery programs that has been for decades is that eliminate the alcohol, eliminate the problem. If you don't ever drink alcohol, you will never develop a problem. That's true, but that doesn't mean that you will get to and understand how your behaviors, why you turn to it in the first place. And if we don't understand that, we can never, drinking or not drinking, you'll replace it. If you don't drink alcohol, typically people will then just replace it with some other behavior type, whether it's opioids or overeating or overspending or whatting. If we don't understand the whys, we will replace alcohol with something else.
Absolutely. Molly, I'm so glad that you raised that, because one of the key things here is that I talked about physiological response is going to be distinct for each drug, because it's related to the way bodies metabolize different drugs, although there is a bit of overlap there too. But these internalizing and externalizing pathways, you are absolutely right. They are not specific to any one drug. They are shared across lots of different drugs, but also with other behavioral outcomes. And so we have found that individuals who are carrying this, elevated externalizing genetic disposition, it can show up, as I mentioned early on, in kids as kind of ADHD, as conduct problems, in adults as substance use problems, but in other kinds of risky behaviors, risky sexual behavior, overeating, compulsive gambling. And so by understanding what this genetic risk looks like, whether you're somebody who just wants to think about how do I kind of optimize my health and happiness, or whether you're someone who is thinking about, gosh, I, want to move into recovery from a particular substance. So how do I actually not just stop using that substance, but promote, a healthier lifestyle? Because ideally that's what all of us want is, we don't just want to not have problems with a particular drug. We want to think about how do we, become the best versions of ourselves, and how do we promote health and happiness? And so understanding these genetic risk factors can be absolutely critical in not just thinking about your relationship with a substance, but your relationship with kind of, your life, your family members, and how you want to kind of promote the best outcomes for yourself.
I love that. Danielle, thank you so much for being here, for taking the time today, for suffering through my ongoing coughing fits. And I can't wait to share this information with my audience. We will link everything in the show notes, but one more time, where can people learn more about you?
So you can go to danielledick.com, where I try and make a whole series of resources available. I mentioned earlier that I wrote a book for parents to help understand genetic influences on kids' behaviors and how we can help them be the best version of themselves, because it turns out that actually, because our kids are all wired differently, they don't respond to us in the same way. And so there's different strategies that can work best for helping, each of our uniquely wired kids as well. You can find more about the book at thechildcode.com. And then the addiction risk profiles that I mentioned are available at addictionrisk.com as well.
I love this. It's so great. I just appreciate you taking the time. And yeah, everybody go check it out. So much great resource information, so much great research that Danielle's done over the course of her career. And you will learn more about yourself, about your brain, and about how that all influences your chosen behaviors with alcohol or with anything else. So thank you again, Danielle. Thank you for being here. And I look forward to the next time I talk to you. Hopefully it won't be coughing in your ear the whole time.
Well, I hope you feel better, Molly. And it was such a delight talking with you today.
Hey, thanks for listening to the Alcohol Minimalist Podcast. Take something you learned from this week's episode and put it into action. Changing your drinking habits and creating a peaceful relationship with alcohol is 100% possible. You can stop worrying, stop feeling guilty about overdrinking, and become someone who desires alcohol less. I work with people in 3 ways. You can learn about them over at www.mollywatts.com/workwithme. Or better yet, reach out to me directly. It's molly@mollywatts.com. We'll jump on a call and discuss what's best for you. This podcast is really just the beginning of our conversation. Let's keep it going.